I want to tell you about the worst meeting I ever ran because it's where this story starts. It was Shanghai, 2014. I was leading a cross functional team through a product launch. We had a room full of people marketing, regulatory, supply chain, commercial. Everyone had a deck, everyone had an opinion, and I had a plan, a tight agenda, and the absolute conviction that if I could just drive the conversation hard enough, we'd reach alignment in 60 minutes. 90 minutes later, the room was hostile. Nobody had aligned on anything. Two people had openly contradicted each other and weren't speaking. The supply chain lead had checked out entirely and was answering emails on his phone. And I was gripping my pen so hard that I'd cracked the barrel. That night, back at my apartment, I picked up a book that had been sitting on my nightstand for weeks. Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki. I'd bought it on a whim. I opened to a random page and read, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few." I sat with that sentence for a long time, and I realized what had gone wrong in the meeting. I had walked in as the expert. I had the plan. I had the agenda. I knew what the outcome should be. And because I'd already arrived at the answer before the conversation began, I'd made it impossible for anyone else to think. I had filled the room with my certainty, and my certainty had suffocated every other perspective. The beginner's mind is Suzuki's term for the quality of openness that exists before expertise closes it down. A beginner doesn't know what the answer is. A beginner asks genuine questions, not rhetorical questions designed to lead people to a predetermined conclusion, but actual questions, the kind where you don't know what the other person is going to say. A beginner listens because a beginner has to. An expert performs listening while waiting for their turn to talk. There's a famous Zen story about a professor who visits a master. The professor talks and talks about his research, his theories, his understanding of Zen. The master pours tea into the professor's cup and keeps pouring after the cup is full. Tea spills everywhere. The professor shouts, "The cup is overflowing." The master says, "Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions. How can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" I have been the professor in that story more times than I want to admit, walking into a meeting with my cup already full, walking into a negotiation with my conclusion already reached, walking into a conversation with a colleague and hearing nothing they said because I was too busy composing my response. The Zen concept of Mushin, no mind, or beginner's mind, and is not about being stupid. It's not about pretending you don't have expertise. It's about learning to set the expertise aside long enough to see what's actually happening, to see the room as it is, not as your plan says it should be, to hear the person in front of you, not the version of the person that your assumptions have constructed. After that night in Shanghai, I started experimenting. I started walking into meetings without a predetermined outcome. I started asking questions I didn't know the answer to. I started leaving silence, actual silence, 5 or 10 uncomfortable seconds of it, after someone spoke, instead of immediately filling the gap with my own voice. The results were startling. People said things I didn't expect. Ideas emerged that my plan would have prevented. The supply chain lead who had checked out turned out to have the most important insight in the room. He just needed silence to say it. And I discovered that my value as a leader was not in having the answer. It was in creating the conditions where the answer could appear. Let me give you a specific example. We were evaluating a market opportunity, a potential new product line for a customer segment we'd never served. The conventional analysis said no. The margins were thin, the competition was entrenched, the risk reward didn't pencil out. I had the analysis in front of me. I agreed with it. But instead of presenting the analysis and closing the discussion, I did something I'd never done before. I said, "I don't know," and asked the room what they thought, not what the data said, what they thought, what their gut said, what they'd noticed that the data hadn't captured. The regional manager A woman who had been in the field for 15 years and who rarely spoke in strategy meetings because she'd learned that strategy meetings weren't interested in field experience, said something that changed the trajectory of the project. She said that the customers in this segment weren't buying our existing products because our existing products solved the wrong problem. The opportunity wasn't to sell them what we had, it was to build something we didn't have yet. The analysis couldn't see this. The analysis could only evaluate what existed. The empty cup, the space I created by not knowing, allowed something new to enter the room. And the something new was worth more than the analysis. I want to be honest about something. I'm not a disciplined meditator. I've sat on cushions and counted breaths and watched my thoughts and been terrible at it. My mind is a boardroom that never adjourns. There are always 17 conversations happening simultaneously, and none of them are listening to each other. But here's what I've learned from the attempt, which is perhaps more valuable than success would have been. The attempt itself changes you. The practice of sitting still for even 10 minutes, of noticing that your mind has wandered and gently bringing it back over and over without judgment, trains a muscle that is useful in every other area of life. The muscle of returning, the muscle of noticing that you've drifted and coming back. In a meeting, this looks like the moment when you realize you've stopped listening and you choose to start again. In a negotiation, this looks like the moment when you notice your ego has taken over and you choose to set it down. In a relationship, this looks like the moment when you realize you're hearing your own narrative about the other person instead of the actual person, and you choose to look again. Rick Rubin writes in The Creative Act, a book I keep close to my desk, that the best creative work comes from a quality of attention that is receptive rather than aggressive. You don't grab the idea. You create the conditions for the idea to arrive. You empty the cup. You sit still. You wait. And what comes is almost always better than what you would have manufactured through force. This is what Zen taught me about running a business. Not a technique, not a framework. Quality of attention, the willingness to not know, the discipline of sitting with uncertainty long enough for clarity to emerge on its own terms, not on yours. The best leaders I've worked with across New York, Shanghai, Singapore, Indonesia, all had this quality. They were not the loudest people in the room. They were not the most certain. They were the people who could sit with a problem long enough to see it clearly, who could empty their cup again and again in a world that rewards people for keeping their cups full. Shunryu Suzuki died in 1971. He left behind a tradition, a community, and a small book that has been quietly changing how people think for 50 years. It's on my shelf between Pema Chodron and Marcus Aurelius. All three of them are saying the same thing in different languages. Pay attention. Be present. Let go of your need to control the outcome. The outcome will be better without your interference. There's a deeper connection here that I want to draw out because it relates to something Hadot writes about in philosophy as a way of life, a book that sits on my shelf and has shaped how I think about the relationship between ideas and practice. Hadot's central argument is that ancient philosophy was not a body of doctrines. It was a set of spiritual exercises, a way of training the attention. Stoicism wasn't a theory about the world. It was a daily practice of noticing what you can control and releasing what you can't. And Zen, in the same tradition, is not a theology. It's a practice of emptying, attending, returning. What I've learned from both traditions is that the gap between knowing and doing is not bridged by more knowledge. It's bridged by practice. I know that I should listen in meetings. I've known this for 20 years, but knowing it didn't change my behavior. Practicing it, sitting in silence for 10 minutes every morning, training the muscle of return, building the habit of the empty cup, that changed my behavior. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. The business world is drowning in knowledge. What it lacks is practice. We know what good leadership looks like. We've read the books, attended the seminars, completed the assessments, and then we walk into a meeting and fill every silence with our own voice. because the practice of sitting with not knowing is a practice we've never trained. Zen and Stoicism and every contemplative tradition offer the same training. Be still, notice, return. The training is simple. The difficulty is doing it when it counts. When the room is tense, when the stakes are high, when your ego is screaming that you need to prove you're the smartest person in the room. That's when the practice matters. That's when the empty cup is hardest to hold. And that's when the emptiness is most valuable. I'm still learning this. I suspect I'll be learning it for the rest of my life. But the fact that I'm still learning it is, Suzuki would say, exactly the point.